position on the discourse on digital sovereignty, because the different stances suggest a lack of consensus on how digital sovereignty should be defined and pursued, whether through territorial control, like positing from a data localization perspective, or a normative kind of leadership that is trust-based governance and interoperability that the data policy framework begins to highlight. And so a unified African position, I think, is imperative to enhance the continent's bargaining power coming from a lower-end bargaining stake, considering the existing infrastructural deficits. It needs a stronger bargaining power in the global digital governance discourse to ensure coherence across continental, regional, and national levels. Secondly, it needs to think about how it balances its economic competitiveness ambitions and how it can, in that same frame, achieve regulatory autonomy, considering its current foreign dependence on technology and innovation wholeheartedly. And so the continent must reconcile the economic promise of opening up cross-border data flows as the DTP of the AFCFTA suggests, with the regulatory need to also protect citizens' data and national interests, because overly rigid localization could stifle innovation and trade, while overly liberal regime could also erode sovereignty and trust. And so, this is not clicking. And the third point is with respect to capacity. Some of the previous presenters in the first panel also laid some assurance with respect to this. This is also critical from a public interest and data governance perspective, from the trust dimension, strengthening these institutions to evaluate and invoke what does the statements around, especially around derogation clauses within the AFCFTA Digital Trade Protocol, what does it actually mean in terms of capacity building within the critical stakeholders that we operationalize those to determine what constitutes, for instance, a legitimate public policy objective or even essential security interest. Ambiguity will always lead to multifarious interpretation, and it will not help to consolidate the positionality of the continent with respect to digital sovereignty, the digital sovereignty discourse. This is okay. With regards to the issues I've raised, there are implications for the region, considering the different policy tensions and emerging alignments points that I have raised. Number one, with regards to regulatory uncertainty and fragmentation, the conflicting continental strategies may lead to inconsistent national implementations, deteriorating and deterring private sector investment, which will hinder digital entrepreneurship that is critically needed on the continent and slow down regional digital trade integration and infrastructure. There's also challenges in global digital negotiations, the continent's credibility and coherence in global digital trade and internet governance negotiations through different channels, the WTO, the OECD engagements, especially with respect to digital taxation, might be weakened if its continental policies send mixed signals on foundational issues on data localization. The varying interpretations of digital sovereignty will highlight a divergent, broader physiological debate on the continent. What should be the perspective? Should sovereignty be defensive and territorial, favoring localization, or networked, strategic, favoring governance interoperability and trusted partnerships? This critical split could create geopolitical vulnerabilities in the face of digital influence from global powers as they begin to engage more on the global landscape tables with respect to some of these issues. In terms of the AFCFTA Digital Protocol that has still not been finalized and yet to begin implementation, the inclusion of some of these derogation clauses, open space for national deviations, potentially diluting the protocol's effectiveness, especially if many states invoke localization for security purposes or public interest without any transparent, clear guidelines or criteria in that sense. And so there's a need for a contextual Africa model, like other regions that I've spotlighted. These contradictions that are currently existing would undermine the need for Africa to develop its own model of digital sovereignty, one that transcends the binary localization versus liberalization, and instead foreground data justice, the issues around discourses within the continent, issues around inclusion, and issues around infrastructure equity. And so some of the imperatives of the issues I've raised are already very crystallized across the continent. If you look at the key issue of cross-border data flows, different kinds of configurations begin to emerge across the region, some very tight, some very weak, because of the continuous ambiguity with respect to a continental position. And so the impacts on data localization, for example, while it might benefit the current data center evolution, there are also the harm that needs to be considered with regards to opening up the broader economy by limiting access to data and forcing firms to store data locally might not be necessarily lead to the kinds of digital development or better protected data, given that there are other key factors, issues around electricity, connectivity, and the likes. And so policymakers are, in essence, they need to face the task of balancing the need for digital sovereignty with the economic impacts of data localization requirements, why the aspiration to localize data is not far-fetched and is being pursued by several countries. The transition to such a model in the continent, we need careful consideration and balancing the different realities of technological independence and international cooperation. And so let me summarize, if this will permit me. Oh, I just have one more slide. So in summary, for Africa, you cannot regulate what you don't have. And so we need to be thinking about, even as some of the developments like the Smart Africa Regional Data Center provisions, the country evolutions around building around our own internet IXPs becomes very imperative, because you cannot necessarily regulate what you don't have control. You can't defend what you don't control. That's in the words of Professor Francesca Brea of the UCL. And so balancing the localization imperatives with what other economic imperatives must be put on that plate, and in essence, a clear perspective of what kinds of position do we want to focus on must be made. Otherwise, the ambiguities will lead to a different approach to how the different countries, as we already see, as it's already beginning to crystallize across the continent, will operationalize some of this position in their own boundary countries with respect to maintaining digital sovereignty as these digital evolutions continue to occur. Thank you very much.
As our second presenter is online, I suggest that we take the questions now. We have about 7 minutes left, so I'll suggest we collect also. One over there, that's great. And please be short.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it very interesting, and I really liked your the insight that you had. You know, there's conflicting ambitions in these different data frameworks of the AU. Yeah, which I always, when I saw them, I always thought, okay, it's crazy that you have so many different frameworks and they don't speak to each other. And I mean, you highlighted one specific area where they conflict, which I think is a good insight. And so I have like 2 questions. So the first one, at the very beginning, you lay out these different approaches by these global players like China, the EU, and the US. But you only mention them in the beginning, and then later when you speak about the trade-off, you know, the data localization trade-off and like the economic imperatives, you don't really reference their positions. And I know you mentioned that they pursue very different models, right? So China with the cyber security approach, the EU with like its data protection frameworks and so on. So I'd be curious to know like where you would position these global players when it comes to this trade-off and how you think about that. And then the other point, I'd be curious to know what actually is your opinion. So if you were to advise African policymakers, what would you suggest? Would you now say, okay, because I mean, at the very end, I think you mentioned we have to think beyond these binary discussions, right? But in the end, you have to make a decision, right? So what would you say? Would you tell the policymakers, okay, you should have like, I don't know, like provisions for data localization? Or would you say, no, it's not necessary, we would rather have like free flow of data across, let's say, a community like the African Union? So what is your opinion on that?
One more over here, and then the third one.
Okay, many thanks for the presentation. You mentioned about the ambiguity and uneven adoption of these policies at the continental level, e.g. the AU digitalization transformation strategy and also AU data policy framework. But my question is, maybe what is the reason perhaps that is giving rise to this ambiguity and unevenness in terms of embrace and adoption? And also, perhaps going forward at a policy level, what can be done to remedy this situation? Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. A very quick question. You addressed the role that the AFCFTA is planning to do in terms of digital trade. I know of the AFCFTA's approach has been in other areas through the regional bodies. Is there any idea of actually bringing in regions within Africa rather than continentally in terms of digital trade?
I don't see any more questions.
Thank you very much for the questions. Let me just start with the first here on my list. Different global models, their trade-offs. I didn't really study the different global models. I just understood what their global frame of reference is. So I don't know exactly what kind of trade-offs that they have put in place. But I know for Africa, there are two key issues with respect to economic independence as well as accelerating innovation as well. How do you balance those off? And so what that means for Africa, I have as a recommendation, which during my presentation with time and the clicking issues I couldn't show, but I'll make those responses as it's very connected to some of the other questions that were asked. And then in terms of recommendations, of course, someone asked, the second question was around what are some of the what would be my recommendations? Of course, yeah, in terms of a recommendation, the key for me is having a singular approach. There should be a singular approach. If we look at what the global dynamics is, China has a very clear, aggressive state-led approach. Europe mainly focused on a rights-based approach. And the US, of course, is a bit of an expansion of their historic market model with very clear state intervention, with huge subsidies from the state with regards to investments in relation to more recent developments around the CHIPS Act, in relation to the current AI war with China and the Complementary Science Act as well. And so for me, first of all, there should be a clear position. There is the AU digital strategy that is still currently operational, 2020 to 2030. It's completely different with respect to what I think is the clear reactionary position of the continent with regards to digital sovereignty, which is the pursuit of data localization and the promulgation of data protection laws across countries, while the data protection perspective might be more uniform with respect to how these are evolving across the continent. The issues around data localization, I think, is where the bifurcation is. With more recent developments in practical terms to these issues, the continent is pursuing an aggressive data center development. There is the current Smart Africa projects around regional data centers. Of course, like I said in my closing quote, you can't really control, you can't really have any kind of, at the end of the day, digital sovereignty is how much independent control do you still have across your infrastructure, across the data, and what does it mean for your economy, for your security, and other complementarities. And so, as African countries begin to, even at the country level as well, the data center evolution is beginning to gain acceleration. So as they begin to build out some of these data centers, my own recommendation is to align more to the provisions of the data, the DPF and the AU data policy framework that was adopted in 2022, which is a more recent. But what I'm just saying is there is the current AU digital strategy that is still in place, and it's completely opposing. Why is this important? Different national countries, which ties to the third question, the reason for some of these ambiguities. Of course, different countries have different weightings for the different kinds of priorities, depending on their own contextual reality. Is it security more? Maybe considering the political situations within the country, they can fly a security reason. Is it economic? Is it technology innovation? Some are much more backward from the digital evolutionary perspective. Some are much more advanced. And so if you're talking to somebody, depending on the weightings of the different, that's why you have these kinds of ambiguities. And because these positionalities are not just imposed from a top-down perspective, or unlike maybe, for instance, the DPI narrative from India, these are negotiated by countries. It is not, even like the question here, what is the role of the regional economic communities? Prior now, the regional economic communities had a very, none of these continental strategies can come to fruition or even adopted or even implemented without a strategic role of the regional economic communities. But in more recent times, like the AU data policy framework, like some of the more recent policies from the continental level, I think that role for regional economic communities is beginning to diminish. And for me, it had worked in the past for these things to be operationalized. At the end of the day, the operationalization of these policies cannot happen beyond at the continental level. The implementation will happen at the countries. And if there is a framework like the regional economic communities that has helped in the past to implement some of these policies, I think a shift, instead of the current narrative of diminishing their capacities, I think their more strategic role should be amplified in order to drive operationalization of these issues. I think that answers the third questions in that sense. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Raymond. We're moving from the AU level to the country level with our second speaker in this panel, Habtamu, Secretary to Woldeyohanis. And your presentation. Habtamu Behanu is our second speaker in this panel. You look very ready. Can I get some tech support about the Excellent. You are visible and ready to go. I'll give you a 2-minute warning when you're
Hello? Hello, everyone. Hello? Hello.
You can start talking. Sorry for the confusion.
Hello, everyone.
So
Hello.
could you reshare your presentation? Excellent.
Excuse me, there's a lot of noise in the background, and you are welcome to start with your presentation. He's got two devices connected, and he doesn't want to unmute. Can I just request, ask him to unmute? He doesn't want to. Let's do this. We'll spotlight him. Okay, you go. Welcome to start. Please start first. There we go. 1, 2. Yes, you can hear us loud and clear.
Hello. Hello.
There we go. We can hear you loud and clear now. Yes, please. You can start.
Can I start?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. I think you are hearing me. Hello, everyone. Okay. Shall I go on? Okay. Thank you. My name is Habtamu from Ethiopia. I am a lecturer of law at Dilla University, Ethiopia. I'm very happy to join you today on this interesting workshop. And Tim. In the interest of time, I will directly go to my presentation. I will follow a little bit informal presentation, as you may see from the title. My paper mainly focus on comparative analysis of Ethiopian artificial intelligence regulatory framework, gap, challenges, and global insights. The very objective of this paper is to examine the artificial intelligence regulatory framework of Ethiopia, or Ethiopian regulatory frameworks, and the relation from global insights. So this is the very objective of my paper. As you know, this is an introduction. In the introductory part, there are some concepts or points that I would like to shed light. As you know, or many of us are aware of it, currently artificial intelligence is affecting our daily life from different perspectives. That means it is revolutionary various industries and including individual daily life. That means it brings different or number of advantages into our daily lives. Despite its advantages or potential advantages, there are so many challenges arising out of the application of this technology. This challenge might be inherent limitation of the technology itself and the quality of the data that those technologies are trained on. So these challenges demand this strong regulatory frameworks that I refer ethical artificial intelligence governance or artificial intelligence regulation in this context. So as you know, artificial intelligence regulation is normally the development of policy frameworks and laws to ensure responsible and ethical use of artificial intelligence or AIs. Shall I go to the next slide? So the importance of artificial intelligence regulation is just this important to foster public trust and the confidence in these emerging technologies. Normally, the ultimate goal of the regulation is just to increase the acceptance and adoption of this emerging technology for the benefit of the society. When we come to the main point of this paper, artificial intelligence is currently becoming more prevalent in Ethiopia. The government of Ethiopia is currently aggressively working on the use and the development of artificial intelligence for different purposes in different sectors, including agriculture, education, health sector, and other public, including the public sector. So, however, as compared to other countries, including global trends, Ethiopia lacks comprehensive regulatory frameworks to regulate the application of artificial intelligence, or what we call AI in short. The existing legal framework are scattered across various legislation that they failed to provide a comprehensive framework on regulating artificial intelligence that to regulate the challenges that are arising out of the application of artificial intelligence or AI specific challenges. So the main point of this paper is to examine whether Ethiopia has adequate policy and the legal frameworks to regulate AIs in Ethiopia. The next part might be about the research methodology. This, as you understand from the objective of the paper, this paper is analyzing the existing policy and the legal framework. Because of that, it is somehow doctrinal legal research or qualitative that rely on qualitative legal research methodology. So in order to address the research objective, it relies on primary and secondary source of data. Primary source of data include various policies and the law that are relevant to the AI regulation. On the other hand, secondary source of data include scholarly materials such as book chapter, journal articles, and other sources to supplement the finding of the paper. Finally, to understand or to determine whether Ethiopia has adequate legal and the policy framework, comparative analysis was used from the experience of United States, Canada, and the European Union. These countries are deliberately chosen for this study for they have or developed structured AI regulatory frameworks as compared to Ethiopia. The next point that follow this methodology is some important points about the regulation of artificial intelligence or regulation of AI. As you know, initially there has been debates whether to regulate AI or not to regulate. As you know, artificial intelligence regulation is, as I mentioned earlier, it is normally the establishment of legal framework, ethical standard, and the technical standards to govern the design and the use of AIs to ensure that AI operated in the way that are ethical, safe, transparent, and aligned with the socio-economic value of the societies in different sectors. Normally, it is a framework that is designed to oversee responsible development and usage of artificial intelligence. The very objective is to harness the potential of AIs while mitigating the risk that arising out of the application and the usage of this emerging technology by ensuring that AIs are developed and used in very responsible manner. This regulatory frameworks or artificial intelligence regulation is assumed to build trusts in the AI technology and encourage in their adoption. The overarching or the very goal of the regulation is to ensure that AI operate in the way that benefit humanity without causing harms. As I mentioned earlier, initially there has been arguments or debates whether to regulate artificial intelligence or not to regulate. There are some arguments that artificial intelligence cannot be, should not be regulated. There are some number of critics that against the regulation of artificial intelligence. These are, they claim that regulating AI may discourage innovation and hinder the competition of the company and the industries working in the artificial intelligence because the regulation framework or developing policy and the legal framework somehow not as such flexible as compared to the development of technology because they are stagnant. So they discourage the innovation. On the other hand, they impede the flexibility and ability to adapt to the new challenges opportunity due to their rigidity. The other point is that they impose significant administrative and the financial burden on the business, potentially slow down the development and the deployments of AI solutions. The other point that is against the regulation of AI is global nature of the technology itself. Is another challenge because artificial intelligence or in this emerging technology is somehow transboundary technology that cannot be limited in the given jurisdiction, the impact. So developing a specific regulatory framework may not align with the nature of the technology itself. The other may be cost of compliance in conducting ethical and impact assessment, hiring legal experts, and adopting to the evolving rules. It could also discourage new interesting. The other and the important point is that regulatory capture. Regulatory capture means that the large techno companies with the extensive resources may influence regulatory process to their advantage, crafting the rule that disproportionately benefit them while hindering the smaller company from entering the industry. And the dynamic nature is another challenges. Despite these arguments against the regulation of artificial intelligence, currently there are a number of emerging or trend that advocate for the regulation of artificial intelligence from different perspectives. Today, a number of ethical AI ethics or ethical guidelines have been already published to maintain the social control over the artificial intelligence technology. The main point of this side are that AI system interact with the broad aspect of human activity. That means without regulation, this technology may inadvertently perpetuate discrimination in the inequality. The other surveillance technology powered by the AI, such as, for example, facial recognition system, may deploy in the way that compromise privacy and individual freedom of expression in particular. The other point may that ethical guideline embedded in the AI regulation can steer the development of artificial intelligence or technology toward social benefit. The other maybe regulation can also play a crucial role in preventing the monopolistic practice in the AI. In that means it may prevent certain companies from monopolying the industry. The other point may by enforcing or establishing a regulatory framework, we can ensure the transparency and interoperability in the AI, in the development and the usage of AI. These are currently the existing and the dominant arguments for the artificial intelligence regulation. To justify or to indicate to what extent the current trends are towards artificial intelligence regulation, I try to see the trends or the practice of some selected jurisdiction, such as United States, Canada, and the European Union, where start from the from the case of United States, the U.S. follows, as you know, U.S. is a federal state structure where the power is divided between regional state or states in the federal government. It follows decentralized approaches where regulatory oversight is divided among the federal and the state agencies, focusing on specific industries such as healthcare and finance, which means United States follows sectorally based AI regulation or regulatory approach. In fact, there is no comprehensive federal legislation on the artificial intelligence regulation in the United States. However, several states like California have already enacted law that addressing specific AI aspects, or for example, consumer privacy protection. For example, Consumer Privacy Act in the California grants consumer rights over their personal data and require business to disclose how they automate the decision making process using personal data. The next case study or comparative study might be the case of European Union. And when we come to European Union has been considered as a front runner in the artificial intelligence regulation, with it is a general personal data protection rules. This rule provide comprehensive framework for the data protection and the privacy, addressing many artificial intelligence related concerns. Moreover, EU has also introduced the AI Act, which aims to regulate artificial intelligence system or AI system and ensure their compliance with ethical standards, transparency, accountability in the development and usage of AI technologies. This act categorize the level of AI risks into 3 levels. The first one is unacceptable level. That means in which AI cannot be used. For example, in European Union, it is strictly prohibited that you can not use AI in social scoring. The other is high risk. For example, digital identification. So the last risk may be minimum risk, which means acceptable risk. The third case study might be that of the case of Canada. In the case of Canada, the same approach is taken to regulate artificial intelligence. For example, Canada already developed AI, ethical AI development through framework of algorithm impact assessment and pan-African, pan-Canadian AI strategy that include ethical principles such as transparency, accountability, and inclusivity. This, the trend of these 3 countries shortly indicate how the current trend of AI regulation is has got acceptance. The next point might be a regulatory approach. In fact, there is no common approaches to regulate artificial intelligence. There are so many regulatory approach. The first one is principle-based approach, risk-based approach, and the sector-based approach. When we see the principle-based approach, it provides a set of principles that provide guidance for the development and the using AI system through ethical, responsible, and the human-centric and the human right obligation. It focuses on transparency, fairness, and the human oversight. The next point approach may be risk-based approach. Risk-based approach try to regulate artificial intelligence depending on their risk. For example, the case of European Union in this case is a notable example. The third point might be sector-based. Sector-based regulation is tailored to address the unique challenge of AI in the different sector. For example, in the AI, the usage of AI in the healthcare, finance, and transportation, and the criminal justice. It develops AI regulation system that is tailored to a specific sector. The last point might be the case of Ethiopia. The main point of this discussion. When we come to Ethiopia, the first point that we can see is regulatory framework in the Ethiopian artificial intelligence landscape, the existing policy, legal, and the legal framework. The first one is national artificial intelligence. Ethiopia, the government of Ethiopia has recently adopted artificial intelligence policy that address AI-specific issue and provide a roadmap for it. It is development. This policy identify key sector, agriculture, healthcare, and the educational sector, and the other sector that are open for artificial intelligence. This strategy prioritize area. This show the commitment of the countries toward digital transformation in addressing both sectoral application of the critical infrastructure. The challenge is that this policy does not say about the artificial intelligence regulation, how to regulate the impact or the negative impact of artificial intelligence. It is just simply recognize the fact that the lack of implicit guideline from the outset could set Ethiopia as the up for complication at the scope and the breach of the work of this technology continue. However, it does not address how to address this complication. It rather define the artificial intelligence governance in terms of hate speech only, while the impact of AI implication is beyond the hate speech. The other legal framework that we can find is personal data proclamation. Normally, this personal data proclamation has some aspect of artificial intelligence regulation, but the issue with this proclamation is that this proclamation enacted before the adoption of artificial intelligence by itself. That means the proclamation does not consider the impacts of AI as it is adopted before the artificial intelligence. The other point is that this proclamation, the application of proclamation is limited to personal data protection, while the impact of artificial intelligence goes beyond personal data protection. The next point that may legal framework that we can find is the FDR criminal law. This criminal law addresses technology-driven crimes. However, the criminal or Ethiopian criminal code does not adequately address artificial intelligence-driven crimes. The next is institutional framework. In Ethiopia, there are some institutional framework related to artificial intelligence. The first one is Artificial Intelligence Institute. Despite the fact that Artificial Intelligence Institute is mandated to develop a legal framework to regulate artificial intelligence, so far there is no specific regulatory framework that is developed by this institute. The other institution might be Ministry of Innovation and Technology, despite the fact that this ministry has a broad power in relation to technology and innovation. It has no specific mandate as far as artificial intelligence is concerned. The other institution may be Ethiopian Communication Authority. This authority has also broad mandate as far as personal data is concerned, as similar to that of the Ministry of Innovation. This authority has no specific mandate as far as the challenges arising out of the artificial intelligence. So generally, Ethiopia legal framework is lacks a specific legal framework to regulate challenges arising out of the artificial intelligence, and even the existing policy framework does not adequately address the challenges that are arising out of the application and the usage of artificial intelligence. So this is the conclusion. The conclusion is what I have mentioned now. The next might be the recommendation to address these challenges. The first recommendation might be to establish AI-specific legislation, adopt multi-model approach, promote capacity building, leverage international cooperation, because artificial intelligence cannot be regulated by a specific or a single organ. It needs collaboration between a legal expert, technology expert, and other stakeholders. And foster public awareness and participation about the usage and the application of artificial intelligence in the country. This is all about my presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Habtamu. Can you just indicate whether you can hear us clearly?
Yeah, I'm
Excellent.
hearing you.
Got the applause, great. Let's open for a round of questions for this wonderful. Yeah, there's one from Jess.
Thanks so much for the presentation. So I might have an obvious question, but I'm just curious if you can reflect a bit on what it is to work with AI in a context where you have a script that is different to the script that most of the LLMs are trained on. So how does it work in Amharic specifically? And then particularly with other Ethiopian languages, what are the impacts of using AI systems that are largely trained on external linguistic programs? Thanks.
Are there any more questions? It would be great to collect a bit. Yes, this one.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I don't know whether it's me, but I think the study sort of like have a gray area for me where you are talking about regulation of AI, and it's not quite clear whether you are, or the study is intending to regulate the AI itself, or maybe the use of AI in Ethiopia. And if it's the latter, which is the use of AI in Ethiopia, I'm wondering how, the regulations that have been established in the Eurocentric and Anglocentric nations are, relevant to the study. And building on that, I would have expected that, of course, you mentioned the Personal Data Protection Proclamation Act, which was put into effect last year in Ethiopia. I would have expected also to have seen a country with a similar context to Ethiopia, like South Africa, because South Africa already has the POPI Act, which sort of like regulates how the data and personal information is used. So maybe if you can talk on that as well.
We do have one more question for you from over here.
Just a brief one. You mentioned the use of AI in agriculture and health, but also in national security. I mean, is there anything of compromising transparency when it comes to this topic of national security?
Would you like to respond to that? Then we can give people time to collect their thoughts for maybe a few more questions.
Okay, thank you. If I understand the question, I may try to highlight the. Let me start from the last question. I think it's all about the application of artificial intelligence in national security. The currently adopted AI policy is recognize the application of artificial intelligence regulation in national security as well. The challenge is that the challenge in relation to this policy is actually the policy is not still accessible. It is not publicly accessible, so it is not possible to access the content of the policy by itself. So I developed this paper even by using the draft policy, including the policy has already identified the focus area in which the artificial intelligence cannot be can be used. Hello?
I'm sorry,
Hello?
we just lost you there. Can you repeat the...
Are you hearing me?
We hear you now. Can you please repeat what you just said?
Hello, I think there is some sort of networks problem. Hello?
We can hear you clearly now. But
Okay, thank you. As far as the case of EU, how do you see the relevancy of the EU regulatory framework? Normally, I try to use the case of EU not to just contextualize the case of EU into Ethiopia, but just to indicate how the artificial intelligence regulation or regulatory framework is getting accepted. While I was working on this paper, there are so many artificial intelligence regulatory frameworks under development. For example, the Kenya artificial intelligence strategies and other African countries. So I just simply use the AU for two things. The first one is the artificial intelligence or the artificial intelligence regulatory landscape of the AU is somehow structured as compared to other countries. That means it gives sufficient or adequate lesson, especially to the developing nations. That means we can draw or lesson from those already developed nations. The next point might be just to indicate how artificial intelligence regulatory framework is getting accepted even in the developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Habtamu. Let's give him another round of applause before we close up this panel. And as you know, all the contact details are available on the program. program, so feel, of course, encouraged to reach out to the online participants as well if you have other questions coming up later on. Thank you very much. I think we're due for a lunch break now.
Thank you. Thank you.